Greetings everyone. Today I'm looking at a lens that isn't so well known, but it can be a very inexpensive option for people who want a bit of telephoto zoom. It's the Sigma 50-200mm f4-5.6 OS HSM, designed for APS-C cameras only. It's small and handy, and it can be found on eBay for only about £70 or $100 US. Its zoom range of 50-200mm is nice and useful, being the full frame equivalent of about 80-320mm, or 75-300 if you use a Nikon camera. So 50mm is slight telephoto, and we can zoom into 200mm, which is reasonably tight. This zoom range is pretty useful on an APS-C camera. The lens's maximum aperture of f4-5.6 means that it doesn't let in much light, so it's not a great lens for shooting in darker situations or indoors. This is partly made up for though by image stabilization, or OS as Sigma calls it, which is important for any telephoto lens. Here's some footage at 200mm without image stabilization, and here it is turned on. It's doing an okay job, but we're still getting a bit of wobbliness. Sigma's image stabilization isn't always the best, in my experience. With its image stabilization and useful zoom range, this little Sigma lens actually has very similar parameters to my favourite APS-C telephoto lens, the Canon 55-250mm IS STM. The main differences are that the Sigma can be found on eBay for a lot less money, but it doesn't zoom in as much. Later on, we'll see if its image quality can give Canon a run for their money. But for now, let's look at its build quality. It's a typical, inexpensive Sigma lens, being compact but a bit of a wide load. Its zoom ring is very nice and smooth to turn, and it has a metal lens mount too. The focus ring turns very loosely and not very smoothly, and it only has about a 45-degree focus path, which is not very precise. The lens focuses internally, so the front element does not turn or extend while you focus. However, there's no full-time manual focusing, so don't try to turn the focus ring when it's set to autofocus. The HSM autofocus motor turns very quietly, but not very quickly, as you can see here. The motor makes clicking noises while it's micro-adjusting. That noise can be heard very clearly if you're using autofocus during video work, as you can see here. Overall, this little Sigma lens is built nicely enough, but its autofocus mechanism is getting a little old-fashioned these days. I've also seen more effective image stabilization. Basically, it's not as nice as the Canon STM lens. Okay, well, let's look at image quality. We'll test it on a 20-megapixel APS-C camera, a Canon 70D. At 50mm and f4, the lens is reasonably sharp in the middle of the image, with average contrast levels. In the corners, the picture is a little softer, but at least there isn't any chromatic aberration really to speak of. At f5.6, the picture is a little sharper and brighter in the corners, but the image in the middle hasn't really improved much. You can stop it down again to f8 if you like, but there's no more resolution to be squeezed out at 50mm. Let's zoom in to 100mm. The maximum aperture has darkened to f5. In the middle of the picture, the lens is decently sharp, but not especially impressive. The corners of the image are a bit soft. Stop down to f8 for much better sharpness though, and back in the middle of the image, the picture has become very sharp. So at 100mm, you have to stop the lens down for a really nice performance. Finally, let's zoom all the way into 200mm. The maximum aperture is now f5.6, and in the middle of the image, the lens remains fairly good and sharp. The corners are a touch softer, but they still look reasonably nice. However, stop down to f8 for great sharpness in those corners, and back in the middle of the image too. So overall, this Sigma lens is averagely sharp with its aperture wide open, and very sharp when stopped down. it's just good. Let's look at distortion and vignetting. At 50mm there's a tiny bit of barrel distortion and some gentle vignetting, nothing really to worry about. Stop the aperture down to f5.6 and we see even illumination across the whole image field. At 100mm we're seeing some clear pincushion distortion which sticks around all the way up to 200mm. Again, there's very gentle vignetting with the aperture wide open. Stop down to f8 to be rid of that vignetting. The minimum focus distance of this lens is about 1 meter. That's a little below average for this kind of lens, but you can still get some good pictures of small subjects. At f5.6, the close-up picture quality is decently sharp, but we also see a lot of purple fringing. There's a lot more sharpness when you stop down to f8, but only at f11 does that colour fringing finally go away. Let's look at how well the lens works against bright lights. Things don't look good. Even if the sun is only close to the edge of the image, we still see plenty of flaring. You're not going to get very out-of-focus backgrounds with this lens because of its quite dark maximum aperture. But normally, the quality of this lens's bokeh is reasonably smooth. Those out-of-focus backgrounds are not too distracting. But with some difficult backgrounds like foliage, the bokeh can look very busy, as you can see here. Overall, the Sigma 50-200mm OS HSM is a decent enough option if you're really looking for the cheapest possible workable telephoto lens for your APS-C camera. It has no particular strengths or weaknesses, however it's just nothing like as good as the Canon 55-250mm IS STM lens which I mentioned earlier, which is sharper, better made and has a longer zoom range. The only real reason to get this Sigma lens is if you really want to save $1 or $5. It's really quite an average lens in every way.